am I? Gosh, I'm totally bugging. Okay. Hello everyone, as you may be able to tell from the warm beverage in my hand, this is a Q&A video. Yes, I've been trying to make this video several times, and by several times I mean probably about 20 at this point. Every single time I go to edit this video, and this is just over the last like 2.5 weeks, every single time I go to edit this video, I have what I can only describe as like a crisis about the way I look, which is not a new thing for those of you familiar to this channel, but it is something, you know, I've got amazing support in my life and all of that, but it is very frustrating and upsetting and in many ways infuriating that this continues to be something with which I struggle. And of course, even though I know like all these rational perspectives on it, the emotional experience of it is like extremely distressing. So working on that, you know, quite a few of you asked how I'm doing, and it's funny actually, first few times I recorded this, I'd be like, I'm doing so well, I'm feeling really good, I'm feeling really grounded, and kind of by virtue of making those videos and having those responses to trying to edit them, you know, a little less well. But it's not just because of trying to make a video. If it were just trying to make a video, I would maybe, I don't know, would I, part of what it's highlighted for me is this pattern in my life lately, also maybe forever. Classic. Being afraid but not realising I'm afraid, or not realising how I'm afraid, not really understanding how I'm afraid. In a way, it's kind of tell us all the time, the fear to begin something. But in other ways, it's not that. It's also coupled with growing up online and all of that stuff. That sense of like never quite being able to disprove some version of what happens when I put something of my life out in public. I think this is all part of a broader picture of what holds me back, the ways in which I hold myself back from making. And I think like a general theme that I've been exploring a lot lately in therapy and kind of putting into practice is understanding where fear comes in. It would be rare that I would use the sentence I'm afraid of, even just like as an observation or being in touch with my own fear. I think I faked it till I made it too close to the sun. An example that I keep bringing up to people as I'm trying to communicate to my friends like what's going on is that feeling when you're on like I love roller coasters, but like when you're on like a really scary roller, it just sort of did just then, but when you're on like a really, really scary roller coaster, and in order to manage the fear of it, sometimes part of me will be like, oh my god, I'm having so much fun, as though I can sort of like slip into the mindset of purely having fun, not just like having fun and feeling a lot of fear. And of course, like there's a broader metaphor there to be teased out, in the sense that the fear is also part of the joy of the roller coaster, but that doesn't mean that the fear isn't there. And of course that bit in the Princess Diaries when her dad writes her the letter about, you know, courage is not the absence of fear. But there are a lot of fears for me involved with making that I think I have slightly shied away from, either approaching it with a kind of bravado. In short, how am I doing? Big question. I'm really excited though, because in about 25 days, I think it's 25 days, I'm going to Mexico for many weeks. One of my friends is coming over and staying here in my room while I'm away, in my flat while I'm away, which is also great. It's like such peace of mind. That's definitely something that has shifted so much for me since buying my flat like 2 years ago, because I lived here 4 years prior to that. I've lived here 6 years now, and now I'm like so aware of like when I leave the flat on its own, by itself, like I don't want to leave it by itself. I had like 3 different leaks. There were 3 different leaks in the building that really affected me in one way or another. Also, my boiler went a month ago, about thereabouts. Things are okay. This has also been a challenging year in some senses, just because I've been paying off this really big tax bill that I hadn't put aside enough money basically to pay off a big tax bill, so I'd set up a payment plan. But it was quite an ambitious payment plan because I wanted to get to the end of the year not having anything outstanding before like the new tax bill came in. Anyway, it's all fine, and it's honestly like it's all part of like the absolute joy of the Turtles All the Way Down film that bought the flat in the first place. Like that's the payment that I was trying, like, yeah, that I hadn't put aside enough for. And part of that was also probably because I redid my kitchen and my bathroom, so everything's okay. It really took me to a place of financial distress that was like a time travel machine to being 19 years old, and this image I will always remember of putting my dad's like debit card, or yeah, it must have been a debit card, into a cash point about two or 3 days maybe after he died, and just seeing minus £3,000 there, and like what that felt like of just being like, oh, okay, so there's like some debt, and then getting into like the equity release stuff and being like, oh, okay, there's a lot of money to figure out, a lot of people to write to, and having to find all of these like horrible health newsletters that he was subscribed to that had different kinds of paid subscriptions there, and just like untangling all the weeds of it and being so stressed out. And then because I'd had to update the student loans company that my dad had died, it meant that they paid me a month later for my final year of uni, which I was just about to go into. And so I was taking over a friend's room while she was doing like a semester abroad in the States. I was taking over her room in like her house with all of her friends and like meeting all these people. Her dad had put down the deposit for that room, which was I think about £1,000. And he asked me to pay him back, and I didn't have the money at that point, and he like checked in a couple of times and I still didn't have the money, and I was like, I like literally don't know what to do because the student loans company hasn't paid me yet, and the cash that I've saved isn't in, like I didn't save knowing my dad was going to die. It wasn't that kind of saving. And I literally came, you know, he died while I was in California, so I was coming from that trip, so I'd just been spending money. Anyway, it was like a very, very stressful time, very viscerally stressful time, and it came after some viscerally stressful financial years. But I'd always been a preparer, and like you can't really, well, like, there's an extent to which you can't prepare for that. It was a real lesson like on what can happen when an experience that feels, for whatever reason, a bit more extreme, transports you literally into like the body of your younger self. But the positive outcome of that, or a positive outcome of that, I think has been like really updating my response to money and financial stress, and also being at the other end of it and being in like just the end of November, December, but it's not that like absolute crisis because I'm not a 19-year-old anymore, and I'm not looking around for like adults to help me and like not finding people to help me. I'm 33 years old, and yes, things are tighter, and yes, we're living in like a cost of living crisis that's awful, and inflation has been just absolutely horrendous. At the same time, I make a lot of money, I have a really good community, and I have a little bit more trust in myself than I ever did now as like an autonomous adult. From like, if you're looking at the transactional analysis thing, I'm like, in that I feel like I'm more in the adult ego state. The other element to this is that, yeah, I'm going to Mexico in 25 days, super excited about it. And for so long, again, this became a real locus of crisis where I would literally stay up all night trying to decide whether or not I should cancel it and what it meant, and whether I was being fiscally irresponsible by trying to book this trip. Just agonizing over it. It was an expression of stress about other things that were going on in my life at the time. In short, that wasn't short. I am really proud of myself for how I have navigated this year, how I've sought help from people, have accepted help from people when they've offered. Another element to all of this, and maybe also that came up in my anxiety around editing, is I really want to be honest and forthright about these things that come up and that happen in my life, and these anxieties that go in and out of my life, but I'm also very aware of their reception, or their imagined reception. Something that also comes up a lot in therapy is this imagined sense of the public, and I think a lot of that fear can creep in when it comes to fear of making, fear of videos, fear of writing, fear of trying things that I want to try, and like trying different approaches to things. But I do think a level of like constant awareness, I think Hank talked about this recently, of how something might be received, or an imagining of how something might be received, but I don't think it's an entire imagining, because we use the internet a lot, we're chronically online, and we've seen a lot of perspectives, and there are patterns in these perspectives, and there are different mindsets and positions. And it's one thing when you're interacting with that with people one-to-one in person, or even in groups in person. It's quite different when you're interacting with that in the online space, because people find things so much more quickly, and say someone doesn't like something about a video and they share it even among their friends, like all their friends are likely also not to like the same thing, and then that message kind of like magnifies. And I think, again, to some extent, I just have to be okay with that and have to navigate and make sure I don't internalize that as that's the correct perspective on things, the critical comments about the way I look or how different I look or whatever. But it's just so familiar for me to take that as, to take the most judgmental, mean perspective as the correct one, because for a very, very long time that's been so familiar to me. It's the way I talk to myself, and so that's also just like something to work on. What was the question here? Was it how am I don't know, or maybe I just started talking about all of this, but that's kind of what a lot of what's been going on in my mind. Apart from How Am I, another really big question has been, what are your favourite books of the year? And my favourite books of the year, I mean, it's not quite December yet, so who knows, there might be some late running entrants. But it's been a great year for reading for me. I think I've read about 114 books this year. I'm tracking them with Storygraph. My goal is 133. 133. I like the number 3. My goal was 33,333 pages, but I've blown past that. Yeah, really happy about that. I was spending a lot of time, I still spend a lot of time on my phone. I was spending a lot more time on my phone last year, and I felt really crap about it. When I feel depressed, I find it really hard to concentrate. I can find it really hard to see sometimes, and I know that this can come up for people. I feel really good when I read, not in terms of like smug about reading so many books, but in terms of just like I feel good in my soul, and I love the way books connect to each other, and something I've just read will inevitably bring things up in the next thing I read. I love that like link of books. I just had it with something. What did I just read? I just finished Angela Davis's autobiography from 1974, which is absolutely fantastic. And then I'm reading now Susan Cain's Quiet, and you would think that there weren't connections there, but it is interesting. I'm finding like my own critiques of Quiet, but then also real resonances in that, and how power is expressed and how coalition is built. The collective is so focused on in Angela Davis's autobiography, and collective organising and places where organising and solidarity were easier to build and where they were more challenging to build. And also Angela Davis grew up in Birmingham. You get a lot of context around that from Angela Davis when she's writing her autobiography. And then Susan Cain's Quiet begins with Rosa Parks. Now, again, it's fascinating to me to read those next to each other, because there's that collectivist focus, and then I feel like in some ways there's an individualistic focus in Quiet, just sort of by default of the genre. But then on the other hand, some of the examples of like the practical examples of times when more introverted leaders have led to really effective results are about not constellation building. Oh my god, what's it called? Oh, you know what I mean. It's just completely thrown out of my head. When you build an agreement together about the best way to approach something, and that these quiet leaders can often be better at listening to other ideas of other ways to approach things. Anyway, whatever. That's just like a really bad example of some of the continuities between the books that I read. Both of those were also library reads. This year I've been really keen to read from my TBR or from the library or from like one of those little free libraries, which is where I found The 5th Season. Oh my gosh. Little free libraries that like people put the little boxes out in front of their house and you can like rummage. North London, full of those. The 5th Season by N.K. Jemisin, a lot of people had recommended to me for a very long time. And then in a little library near me, I found 2 copies. So I got to not only take one for free, but I also got to pick my favourite so that I could crack it by myself. Sorry, Rosianna. I loved The 5th Season, and I understand why so many people recommended it to me. It is the first of a trilogy, the Broken Earth trilogy. I borrowed the subsequent books from my library afterwards. All people live on one continent, the Stillness, and they have gone through a lot of ecological destruction and dismay, but they're also a group of people who have different abilities, and those abilities connect with what they can do with the earth. They can cause earthquakes, they can cause volcanoes, they can cause Taurus? I think it's called a Taurus of ice to come in. Like, they're very, very connected to the elements, and they're, of course, very much outcast by society and treated violently, and in many cases killed when they're discovered. So it's a very dangerous way to live. But the Stillness isn't all one community, it's lots and lots of different communities. So that's just one perspective on it. And I think perspective is the right word here, because I think at the time that I read this, I'd read a few books in a row that I just felt really frustrated with the lack of voice and the lack of perspective, and it kind of like I couldn't work out what exactly it was, whether they just hadn't had enough time to edit, whether they'd been like rushed through to the publication, or just it was this feeling of reading a book and just not being able to distinguish between main characters. I read a book that was really, really popular and a lot of people loved, and I just felt like I was reading the most 2D description, and not in like a literary interesting way, because I'm guilty of loving a literary and interesting distancing and what does that mean, and kind of unpacking it in that way, and yeah, that's me. I'm sorry, and I love it. But this book, The 5th Season, has so much play with perspective and voice, and in a way that is absolutely fantastic. And the plot is great and fascinating. Like, the world is so well built and sustained over all 3 books. Obelisk Gate, when I posted that I'd got it out of the library, a lot of people messaged me on Instagram to say, oh, I find that one kind of slow, or I struggled a little bit with it. And I understand why, but at the same time I really loved it, because it's all set, or it's predominantly, I think it's all set, or I don't know, I want to say it's predominantly set in one community, and that reminded me so much, and some of you will have watched this with me, of the 1957 Journey to the Centre of the Earth, which was a film I grew up watching so often with my mum, and has some amazing and very memorable scenes to me of our band of travellers venturing below the earth, Gertrude of course being the most important of them, Pat Boone the least important, and Kostrima, which is the community in the second book, reminded me so much of Journey to the Centre of the Earth in a way that just like made my heart fill with glow. And similarly to kind of as I was talking about with autobiography, it's over there, that's why I'm pointing in that direction, with Angela Davis' autobiography, it discusses a lot of community and places where community building is really effective and places where it can be challenged. More about that in a second, but the third book, The Stone Sky, ties together the trilogy brilliantly. It absolutely sticks the landing and continues to add to it. Like, it's not just tying up all these knots, it's also adding more to the story, and I really appreciated that about it. I think it's an absolutely fantastic trilogy. To that note about collectivism, I was thinking a lot about Octavia Butler, like such a legend of the genre, and for a while in my head I was trying to make this slightly artificial distinction of like, is this closer to Parable of the Talents, Parable of the Sower, or the Xenogenesis trilogy? And I think actually it is closer to the Xenogenesis trilogy, even though the first book felt a lot like Parable of the Sower and had a lot of similarities for me with Parable of the Sower, or maybe they're both. Maybe it's closer to both of them. But Xenogenesis discusses, those 3 books in the Genesis trilogy discuss a lot about hierarchy and the challenges of hierarchy. But then I guess Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents also talk about that and like the challenges of building a community. And they have that journey element. I don't know, whatever, it's great. That's the 5th season. The second book I'm going to mention is Halse by Margaret Atwood. I got this from when either Hannah Sana or Alina was doing a big, listen, they've got very similar sounding names, was doing a big clear out a while ago, I think probably like several years ago, and I picked this up because I love Margaret Atwood. I think she's such a funny writer, even though I know like Handmaid's Tale is the one that you're going to probably think of first when you think of Margaret Atwood, but she's a really funny writer, and this is a really funny book while also having a lot of gravitas as well, and funny gravitas. I don't know what I'm saying anymore. I'm just like tangling myself up in words. But okay, so what I will say for this is if you don't like Shakespeare, I do think you'll enjoy this book. But if you do like Shakespeare, I think you'll absolutely love this book. And it's a retelling of The Tempest. And like any good Shakespeare retelling, and retelling of The Tempest specifically, it has a play within a play. So the premise is that a theatre director in a small town in Canada feels he has been unfairly usurped in his position. He's kicked out of his role by some other big cheese in the situation, and he waits a patient 12 years to enact his revenge. It was very warm, it was very funny, it was kind of outrageous in certain points. It had so many magical elements, as the play The Tempest does, and for me as a big fan of Shakespeare, it made me so happy. It plays with format too, like it's primarily told through prose, but then there are acts in it, and there are moments where it's written out as a play text. So that's Halse by Margaret Atwood. I'm mostly focused on reading my physical TBR, which is over here behind me this year, and also getting some books out from the library and finding free ones out and about. But I did buy a few books, and one of them was Greta and Valdine by Rebecca K. Riley, which I'm so glad I bought because I loved it so much. So Rebecca K. Riley is a Kiwi author. It came out in New Zealand in like 2021 and just like dominated bestseller lists over there, and came out here in 2024, which is still this year, just about. If you live in the US, it's actually not out there yet. Sorry, it's coming out in spring. You can't have everything first. The limes are so good. I love them so much. This is about 2 siblings. Both of them are queer, and both of them are exploring, and they've got different relationships with love, with queer love, and with love for each other. And I think that's what, I read this in September, and I was so depressed that month. There was so much going on in my life, and I was really overwhelmed by it, like a lot of heavy decisions. Okay, I'm going to buy this book, which I've wanted to read for a while, and I'm going to take it home, and I'm going to sit on my sofa onto my weighted blanket and start to read it and trust that I'm going to love it. And sure enough, I did love it, and it's so funny, it's so lovely, it's so loving. It has all these explorations of different kinds of love, and that way in which siblings have completely different relationships to each of their own family members, and also not just to that family member, but also to that family history and what is a family history. I loved it. I don't know if you can tell. And then the last one I'm going to mention, I actually don't have in my physical hands because it was a library book, but The Ministry of Time, I think, is probably my favourite book of the year. In the near future, the UK government has discovered time travel. And what has the UK government, in their wisdom, decided to do with their time travel abilities? They decide to bring people who have been recorded as deceased or missing in the past to the present day. And they've assigned them bridges. Bridge is the term. The novel is told from the perspective of the bridge, who is a civil servant whose job it is to observe this expat, as they call them, from the past and help them assimilate to 21st century culture. It is such a fantastic, funny book and has so much to say about the absolute banality of evil that is the way in which our immigration system works, our asylum processing system works, the different types of migration, immigrant, what it means to assimilate, like what it means to be a citizen of the UK, like the life from UK test kind of stuff, the absurdity of it, but also the horror of it. But also there's a love story that I had no idea was part of it. What I think happened is I read Gretchen and Valdine, which has just like such beautiful explorations of love, and I watched finally 4 years later than everyone else Crash Landing on You, and just devoured it in a matter of weeks. Was absolutely sobbing over it, but I really felt like it made me believe in love again. And also, not even that's a really poor way to put it. It's more that it like reminds me that I do believe in love, and I do love love. And so there were lots of kind of things moving around in that department. And then I was reading The Ministry of Time, and I was like, oh, just like, it's a great love story. It's hot, and it's like also got this time travel element. Absolute instant win for me. And, you know, discussion of migration at the Home Office, also another win for me. So, and the voice, it has so much voice, there's so much perspective. It's like the complete antidote to what I was talking about, what I had been experiencing earlier in the year. The narrator in the story, The Bridge, her mum, I think, is from Cambodia. I can't remember if both her parents are from Cambodia, but her mum's ever from Cambodia, and so people always bring up like the genocide to her, and she's like, what is my connection to that? Is there a connection I should have to that? And like kind of she's teasing out all of that over the course of the novel as well, as you're dealing with this like bureaucratic time travel novel slash hot romance slash brilliant book. The Ministry of Time. I think it's perfect. I loved it. On the non-fiction front, just briefly, I read Doppelganger by Naomi Klein a couple of days before the US election, like oddly, like not intentionally, just worked out that way. That was the first winner of the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction, which I've been a patron of the Women's Prize before. I'm not currently, but hope to be a patron of the Women's Prize again because it's great, and I love that there's a non-fiction prize as well. What other non-fiction have I liked? I mean, Angela Davis's autobiography I've mentioned like 17 times already. There are a lot of them. There are also a lot of good non-fiction reads, but maybe I'll prep that question better and come back to it another time. And now, having explained where I'm at and answered about 2 questions, I do actually need to go because I'm going to see a contemporary dance performance in about an hour and 15 minutes. But thank you for your love. I posted about also this on Instagram. I really don't like Instagram, but I do post on there a lot. And I posted about elements of this, and you just sent me such nice messages. So thank you for that. I did mean a lot. Time to go see some contemporary dance.